that's going to be my first few slides actually. So
Oh,
I'll talk you through that. I've got maybe 5 to 10 minutes where I'm going to give you a little brief history sort of about myself and about my career and how I ended up being invited to talk to you today. Um, so I'll start off by saying I'm a statistician now in the UK government. So I use statistics every day in order to try and drive policy decisions in the UK environmental space. But before that, I was an academic. I have a training in marine biology. I did an undergraduate degree here in marine biology and coastal ecology at the University of Plymouth. And then I did a PhD at the University of East Anglia in how the oceans can help influence or dictate the global climate. So a grounding in that field, but what I picked up there really was statistics. So I'm trying to flick through my slides here. Perfect. So I guess my statistics career really took off when I was taking a postdoctoral position at the Marine Biological Association of the UK. In this position, I was looking at the microbial composition of the oceans, so all of bacteria, fungi, and phytoplankton, and trying to understand how they were different between different locations, and how they were influencing a really specific part of the carbon cycle. So how carbon gets from the atmosphere into the surface ocean and then deposited in the deep ocean. And I was using lots of statistical tools to understand what was driving that process and how I could tell that what the conditions that I was seeing in the environment were being driven by what we hypothesized they were. And statistics is a key tool at making sense of the numbers that you get from experiments and how they relate to the real world. So during this time, I published a few journals. So I was looking at macromolecular composition of different fungi, how they grow on different substrates. And I'll talk a bit later on about how you design a statistical experiment to measure that. And I was also looking at development and again, I'll talk in future slides about how we can measure that, what we need to control to measure that, and how we can apply statistical tests to understand the results of our experiment.
Seth Thomas, so I understand you're going to be back for many lectures, correct?
I think that is yet to be confirmed, but that's the plan.
Yes. So
Yeah,
that is the plan, and I like the plan because
yeah.
you can't cover statistics all in one hour.
No,
So
no. So today is just an overview. Um, if we fast forward to the start of 2020, we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and at that point, as a marine biologist, I was thinking, is what I'm doing adding value to societal challenges? Am I helping face the challenges of the day? And the answer to that question as a marine biologist was no. So I took up a position at the UK Office for National Statistics, where I started applying those statistical techniques that I learned as a marine biologist to the COVID pandemic and trying to understand why disabled people and people from different ethnic backgrounds were dying at disproportionate rates in the COVID pandemic. So this led to another couple of studies that we published in the British Medical Journal and also in Age and Aging, trying to understand what factors were driving different effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Why are some people dying at greater numbers than other people? And statistics is a key tool, particularly when it comes to epidemiology, about understanding the effects of what you're seeing in the real world, taking that understanding from the raw numbers that you're getting. We fast forward to what I do now. I am an advisor at the Department for Environment and Food and Rural Affairs in the UK, where I drive environmental progress across the United Kingdom. So I look at using statistics to find out what levers we can pull to drive environmental policy, what effect enacting policy A might have at location B, and carrying that through to measure our progress against environmental targets. And then I also have a freelance business that I run from Upwork, where I deal with different research questions that people may come to me with as a sort of statistical consultant. That leads to production of things like visuals that go into academic journals, different types of data visualization. And these are the first way really that we begin to understand what raw numbers are telling us and how we can translate that into meaning. So the golden thread that draws my entire career together is statistics. And I want to emphasize this because you're in this class because you have an interest in learning how to use statistics or how to gain insights from data that you're collecting. And if it's a skill that you can master, then it will really set you up for your future career because it's needed more and more and more as time progresses. So that brings us really to the class today as a whole, which is what are statistics and how can we use them. I want to start with a quote from Professor Clive Humby, who is a statistician in the UK at the University of Sheffield, who in around 2006 stated that data is the new oil. And what he means by that, and why I agree with it, is that data is the thing that's going to drive the next revolution in society. It's going to be the thing that has value. And if you can understand how to use it and you can understand how to exploit it, it will set you up well for your career. But also, more and more data is being produced every day. There's something like 70 billion emails sent daily. All this data being produced whenever you're on your phone, you're on social media, it's tracking your data. Whenever you're posting something, you're adding data. If you can understand how to use it, it's only going to serve you well, because more and more data is being pumped into the world every day. Now, statistics is really the process of using that data to understand the world and how we make better judgments from it. So I'm going to highlight 2 points here. The first is statistical science and the second is data, because they are two different things. Data is all of the raw numbers that we collect from the world. You know, it's people's height, it's people's weight, it's how much money you have in the bank, it's how fast you ran your last kilometer. Data is everywhere. Statistical science is how we take that data and we find out or gain insight from it. So are we earning more than we earned last month? Are we running quicker than we ran our last kilometer? Without this science, data is meaningless. On its own, it doesn't imbue any meaning. It doesn't cover anything. You need to take it and you need to put it into context. And statistics is the method in which we do that.
It's like the difference between flour and eggs and bread.
Exactly, yeah. You combine them together to get a useful product. If you combine data with statistics, you get insight. So data can come in many forms, and I'll cover a couple of those now. Strings will be any kind of text data. So, for example, somebody's name, the name of a location. Binary data comes in true or false, yes or no. There are categorical data or factors, and these usually come in the course of groups. When you're designing a laboratory experiment, for example, you'll have treatment 1, you'll have treatment 2. You'll be testing the differences between those treatments. Numeric data, which is obviously the one that we come across most, people's age, people's height, people's weight, anything that can be quantified as a number is numerical data. And then you've also got dates, and I bring that up because yes, they are kind of a number, but when you go to perform your statistics, if you're doing it over time, there are specific considerations that you have to take in terms of how you handle them in statistical software. And then there's also geospatial data, which is more of a position in space, so a location on a map. What are its coordinates? That data sort of behaves differently when you're analyzing it to the others. It can exist in multiple locations, so you can either be assembling it or collecting it yourself. If you're doing a laboratory study, you could be downloading it from different web applications or different websites, or you could be pulling it in using a kind of coding approach via APIs. And when we bring that data together, we call it a data set. Now, the advantage of modern computing and the fact that there is data everywhere is that you can take data sets and you can join them together, so you can end up with a really comprehensive set of data to try and answer any questions that you might be looking to test statistically. So to give you an example of this, when I was working as a marine biologist and I was looking to understand what environmental factors were influencing this population of microbes, I was able to gather data on site by looking at what was the temperature of the water, what was the depth at which we took a sample. That was recorded as part of the data, but then I was also able to pull data from local weather stations. That was what was the weather at the time, how much rainfall had there been in the previous 6 months, how much water had come out of a nearby river that might affect the salinity. All of these things you can source and you can draw together, and you can use
Thomas,
statistical computing.
I have an important question. If you go
Okay.
out and gather data in your community, can you sell that data to anybody?
It really depends on how the volume of the data that you're collecting. Um, if you are doing like a relatively um, confined study, I would say no. If you're setting up long-term sensors, then there are ways in which you could monetize that. In if you hosted it and you sold people access to the API so they could pull that data down, then that's one way of monetizing it. But sort of direct sort of person-to-person sales, I would say no, it's not really possible. You'd have to have a large volume of data for someone to be interested in purchasing it.
Thank you so much.
No problem. So when you're gathering this data together, you can use statistical computing software. So here I've highlighted two, which are open source, so they're free to use. R with one language and Python is another. And you can draw this data together and you can join it if you've got variables that are in common. So for example, if you've got time in one data set and like salinity of the seawater, and you had time in another data set and temperature of seawater, you could join those together using the variables that they have in common, which in this case was time, and you can create a bigger data set. And you can do that exponentially. So you can create more, bigger and bigger data sets, drawing in all the data that you might need to answer your question. So each piece of assembled or collected data we call a variable. So in the examples I've already given, temperature would be a variable, depth would be a variable, time would be a variable. And all of those variables together are what make up your data set, or as the statistical software calls it, a data frame. Now, the challenge for us to use data and gather data is that it differs from place to place. The temperature isn't a constant, it varies. It differs from person to person. People aren't all the same height, people aren't all the same weight. And it differs between replicate and replicate. So say if I had a flask, the contents of that flask would not be identical to the contents of the same flask, of another flask that I had in my experiment. And we call that variability. And it's one of the key things that we look to address when we're doing statistics. I want to talk briefly about the difference between accuracy and precision, because they're often confused and they're not the same. So if I'm collecting data, I want to do it accurately and I want to do it precisely. A inaccurate approach, or not accurate and not precise, is the plot on the right. And you can see on my target, my points are very spread out and they're not very close together. That shows that I'm lacking accuracy because I'm not hitting the center of the target. So I'm not measuring the true value, and I'm lacking precision because each measurement that I make, I'm not getting close to the other measurements. If we go one plot to the left, which is the accurate and not precise, you can see that it's accurate because it's relatively close to the center of the target, but my points are still quite spread out. So from measurement to measurement, I'm not consistent and I'm not precise. One further plot to the left, you can see I'm not accurate, I'm not hitting the center of the target, but I'm very precise because all of the measurements that I'm making are close together. So you might be able to attribute this to some kind of instrumentation error, for example. You know, it's not calibrated correctly, it's off by a few measurements, but it's measuring consistently, so you can trust it. The ideal situation is that we are accurate and precise. So we're hitting the center of the target, we're measuring what we want to measure, and we're measuring it very, very consistently. The closer that you can get to being accurate and precise, the more powerful your statistical tests can be. If you have a lot of variability in your data and you're checking whether your two populations are different or your two test tubes are different from one another, it's very difficult to do that, and you have limited chance of proving it statistically if you don't have accuracy and you don't have precision. Another challenge that we face is that data is naturally imperfect. It never measures exactly what we want it to. If I wanted to measure, for example, how many trees there are on the planet, it's an absolutely mammoth task for me as an individual to go around and physically count the number of trees. What's more likely is that I would take a representative sample of land. I'd take an area, I'd count the trees within that, and then I would apply it to the area of the surface area of the world. That's going to have an inherent error because trees aren't evenly distributed across the whole planet. there's going to be more in some areas than there are than others. And what I'm doing is effectively taking an educated guess by taking a sample and applying it up. That means that perhaps in this case, I'm not being entirely accurate, I'm not being entirely precise, and I have to consider that when I come to analyzing my results and interpreting my results. Another example would be if I asked you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy were you when you woke up this morning? There's no confines on what counts as a 1, and there's no confines on what counts as a 10. One person's 1 could be another person's 5. One person's 10 could be another person's 7. You know, so there's this natural variability in data where it's naturally not entirely what we want. And statistics is about making the best of the data that you have available and trying to gain insight from that. It was mentioned by the host talking about how perhaps you do statistics first before doing more complicated maths. And I think that does hold true, particularly in today. So there's three sort of hierarchies that I want to mention. And at the bottom of that is statistics. It's fundamental to more advanced analysis, and the more advanced analysis you do, or the bigger your data set, generally the higher paid the contract that you might get, or the more valuable your insights might be. And statistics is fundamental to each of those. It's encased in machine learning, which I always feel is a little bit of a black box, and that nobody ever really tells you what it is. But even taking an average is machine learning, because you're providing a machine with information and you're asking it to make assumptions from it. And if I gave it all of your heights and it gave me the average height, that's machine learning. And there's also data science, which is it's becoming much more prominent today. And it basically encompasses mathematics, statistics, gathering data, organizing data and storing it, and then applying machine learning or large models like AI, large language models. So if you have any interest at all in getting into that space, then statistics is really fundamentally your first step. And if you have a good understanding of that, it will set you up well for progressing in a career in that direction. So I'll come back to this quote, which is from Nate Silver, who wrote a book called The Signal and the Noise. And what it says is that the numbers have no way of speaking for themselves. We have to speak for them. We have to give them meaning. And by that, I mean all of the data that's around us doesn't tell us anything as just a number. We have to say, these are the numbers. We're going to arrange them in this way to try and gain insight in a specific field or a specific condition. So let's look at putting some statistics in context really quickly. And it's really easy to mislead people if you don't provide context. So what I've got in this table is a list of UK hospitals and the number of babies that are having surgery after being born, and the number that survive for at least 30 days after that surgery. And if I look at it at the moment, I can make certain deductions from that table. I can say that, okay, wow, there's a lot of babies having surgery in Southampton, and there's a lot of babies surviving in Southampton, and there's less babies having surgery in London, but the number of babies surviving, there's also a lot of those happening. But if I wanted to tell which hospital is having the best success rate in terms of these surgeries, I can't deduce that very well without providing some context. For example, I might want to bring in and calculate from those the number of babies that passed away within 30 days. And I'm getting more insight now because the numbers are telling me more information. And I can go one step further and I can say, okay, maybe I calculate the percentage that survived or the percentage that did not survive. And by doing these calculations, by taking the raw data that I have in my leftmost columns, doing some really simple maths, just calculating a percentage to put it in context, the insights that I gain from that data are immediately more impactful. They're immediately more understandable. And I could then use that to inform decision making. I could be saying, okay, Southampton has a lot of babies dying, but actually it's performing very well because the percentage is very low. They've got a very high survival rate. the same with London. You know, they may have a lower number of babies having surgery, but relatively speaking, when you consider their patient base, they've got the highest percentage of babies that survive that surgery for at least 30 days afterwards. So statistics is all about taking your raw data, finding the right calculation to do or the right statistical test to do to give you the insight that you're looking for, you know, to make decisions, and to refer to the quote at the beginning of this session, you know, to understand what's happening in the world. The way that you frame your answer is also really important, particularly when it comes to decision making. It's much easier, or it sounds much better, to say that 95% survived for the 30 days after the surgery. However, if you used the negative aspect of that, what you're saying is immediately more sort of inflammatory. It may make people more angry. It may make people, you know, appalled or disappointed. If I say the death rate, that's immediately negative than saying the survival rate. So if you think about the way that you frame your answer, tailor it to your audience, the impact of your calculations and your statistics are going to be better received. So it's always something just to bear in mind, and it's something we might cover in future sessions, depending on the direction that we go in. The other thing that you need to think of is when you're collecting your data or when you're looking at variables, are they actually related? There are two concepts in statistics that are key to understanding it. One of those is correlation, which is how closely different variables follow the pattern of one another. And the other one is causation, which is, does a change in variable X cause the change in variable Y? Now, causation is often what people are looking for in statistical tests. If you're designing an experiment, you want to understand if the conditions that you're changing are causing an effect, because that helps you understand the process. What people often measure is correlation, which is how well linked they are. Now, if you do that with an experiment where you're controlling it very finely, and you say, if I give plants more light, they will grow more, that's a causal link because you understand the process. If you take two variables and just see whether they're correlated, that doesn't mean that one's causing another. So I pulled out an example here, and this is from a book called Spurious Correlations. And what it plots on the left is the amount of honey produced by bees in the United States. And what it plots on the right is the number of people who drowned after falling out of a fishing boat. Now, we're all smart people. We know that the amount of honey produced has no effect for people falling out of boats. But if you ran a statistical test on this, looking for causation, it would tell you this is causation because they're really linked. And we can see that in the graph, you know, as the number of deaths go down, the amount of honey produced is also going down. So you have to be switched on, and you have to understand what it is that you're trying to measure when you're selecting the variables that you're going to test against one another. Another example is deaths of people becoming tangled in bed sheets and the per capita cheese production of the United States. Again, we're smart people. We know that these variables are not related, but unless you are providing your statistics in context, unless you're measuring things that are relevant to one another, if you ran the test, it would tell you that cheese is causing people to get tangled in their bed sheets, which is not the case. So we need to think really carefully when we're designing statistical experiments that the data that we're capturing or the data that we're drawing from the internet is actually useful and is actually going to help us in answering our question, or it's going to make it more difficult. So that brings us to the next sort of second half of what I wanted to talk to you about today, which is how we use statistics in research, and how they can help us answer the questions that we pose, either as scientists or as members of the public, and understanding the data that's around us. So I wanted to talk quickly about the outline of a research paper. And generally, when you're writing one, you should follow what we call the hourglass format. So if you picture an hourglass or you know, a sand time turner that I've tried to illustrate on this slide for you, it starts very wide, and that's where you write your introduction to your research question or what you're trying to say. You start very wide. You say maybe what other people have found before, what this means, and leads into what you want to measure as you get narrower down the hourglass. And at the pinch point, you've got your methods and your results. So these are arguably the most important points that you'll make in your research paper, which are how are you going to answer the question? What are you going to measure when you're trying to answer that question? And what did that measurement tell you? So the first two of those, what you're going to measure and how you're going to do it, that's your methods section. Your results are really, what did that tell me? You then start to move out again. So you're getting less focused. You're talking more broadly about your results, what they might mean in context, perhaps how they align with what other people in the field have also found. And you'll conclude that by saying, this is what I found. It aligns with the study of X, Y, and Z, again, ending in a really wide point. So what this is really trying to emphasize is that at the crux of every single research paper, apart from maybe if it's a literature review, the methods and the results are the most important part. And that's where you should be starting to design your study and where you should be doing the most thinking about what it is that you're going to do. And now there's a model that helps us do that. And it's the PPDAC model. This stands for problem, plan, data, analysis, conclusion. And we're going to go through each of these in turn. We'll start with the problem, and it's about understanding and defining the problem. You're thinking about how do we answer the question at hand. If we move through to the plan, sorry, I can't even read my slides because you're blocking my way. Just got to move where you're on my screen for a second. So the plan is really about what we want to measure and how we're going to do it, how we design that study, and how we collect the data. This is the first thing that you do before you put pen to paper, before you start writing. You want to understand, what's my question? How am I going to measure it? What data do I need to answer that question? Do I need to pull that data from the internet? Do I need to take it from different sources? Do I need to go out and collect it? If I'm going to go out and collect it, how am I going to do that? Do I need to go to different study sites? Do I need to take different samples back to a laboratory? Do I need to ask different groups of people different kinds of questions to help me get to the bottom of what it is that I'm trying to uncover? So what you need to do when you're thinking about this is realize that there are aspects of statistics that are outside of our control. I'm just going to minimize you for a second so I can see my slides. So to ensure that we test what we want to test, we need to isolate its effect as best we can. So in laboratory studies, we have things that we call control variables, where we'll make sure that we provide the same conditions. And in environmental studies or person-based studies, we have to use specific statistical methods that help us account for differences between people. In multivariate studies, so these are studies like the ones I talked about at the beginning, when I was looking at the effect of the COVID pandemic on different groups of people, we have to hold different variables constant to account for their variation. So perhaps we need to consider the impacts, outside of age and outside of the confines of different ethnic backgrounds, outside of the confines of different levels of maybe socioeconomic deprivation, in order to get to the crux of the matter and understand the key drivers of our study. So if we work through a really quick laboratory example, the question that I'm asking here is, do different food sources result in different growth rates for a group of, let's say, plankton, which is a small microbe that you find living in the sea? In order to test this, I'd need to isolate the effect of the different food sources. So I do that by having a control treatment on one side, which is the left-hand side of the slide, and I have an experimental treatment on the right side. Now, what I would do is I would make sure that everything that I could possibly control was controlled for, and the only difference between these two treatments is the type of food source in the experimental treatment versus the control treatments. So things that I might have to control for are things like temperature, I'd grow them in an incubator, so I knew that they were experiencing the same temperature. I'd control the light regime, so that I knew they had the exact same number of light hours and dark hours as each other. I'd control for the composition of the water. I'd make sure that it was the same salinity. I'd make sure that it was the same pH. I'd make sure that as close as I could, that the only difference between these was the food source, so that when I was then measuring how much they had grown, I know that that difference is down to the only difference between them, and that's the food source. If we consider an example from like a person-based study, in this case, we'd be asking, does a physiotherapy regime help improve somebody's strength? It's more difficult to control for everything. People are different. I've tried to illustrate this here by saying they're different heights, they're different sizes, they're different weights. They may have different histories. You know, someone in the control group might have had a significant shoulder injury, and someone in the test group might be an Olympic athlete. We just don't know. So we need to be able to test the effect of our intervention while accounting for those natural individual differences between people. So in this case, you would either measure perhaps just the change at the start of your physiotherapy regime. You'd measure like your strength at the start and then your strength at the end. And you would just look at the difference between those two values. Or you could use a more sophisticated statistical test, something like a linear mixed effects model, where it allows certain variables to change between your participants, and it would help you to isolate the effect of just our physiotherapy regime rather than all of that contextual characteristics, such as their age, their weight, their height, their prior experience, and it allows us to focus in on exactly what it is that we are looking for. If we didn't do that, we might find that just because the composition of our groups was different, we either don't see an effect of our physiotherapy regime or we see a huge effect. And we just want to understand, is that actually true? And that's what statistics helps us to do. So if we move on to data, we need to think about how we're going to collect it. We need to think about how we're going to manage it. And I want to talk to you really quickly about something called data cleaning, which is perhaps the most valuable skill that you can try and acquire during your time as a student. Data management is really simple. You know, sometimes we've got these very simple spreadsheet-based tools like Microsoft Excel or Numbers if you use a Mac. And we can use those to record our data. We can record infinite data almost in these, depending on our study. You know, UK government still uses Excel. It's used across the world. It's used across business. And it's really, you can do some really powerful things in there, and you can do some really complex statistics in there. But what you have to consider when you're thinking about which management software to use is how big your data is going to be. Because these spreadsheet-based tools, they interact via a point and click method, it can be really hard to analyze very, very big data sets within them. If you were collecting data from online, or if you were drawing down really big data repositories, perhaps that you wanted to join together to give you more statistical power, you'd want to look at using something that's more code-based, something like Visual Studio Code, which is in the top left of that square, Spider, which is a Python interface, R, which is the tool that I use a lot for analyzing big data and doing machine learning methods. And then also there's another one called Stata, which is really geared at when you have survey data. And what these tools allow you to do is interact with really big data sets. It allows you to join big data sets together, and it allows you to really exploit the data that you have available in a more powerful way than perhaps Excel and Numbers do based on how you interact with it. They also help you make much more. Sorry,
Can you just define one more time what is code based?
So code based is where you would interact. With your data by writing code and running it. So I just so happen, if I can, I'll give you an example. So for example, this is how you would write code to interact with your data. And what it allows you to do is you only have to write this once and you can apply it to lots of different data sets. And it would make you similar outputs. So if you were doing studies that were quite similar to each other and you really wanted to think about your analysis step once, you would perhaps use one of these code-based tools where you write the code to analyze the data, and then you can recycle that over and over again.
So
So
it's
if you
not just
conduct,
you're not just formulating you're not just putting in formulas, right? You're talking about how to use the data, how to take out the outliers and things like that.
yeah, so you can use it to do all of those things. You can take out outliers, you can cut the data in specific ways. You can say, for example, you took a really big data set, let's say like the UK census, for example. In the UK census, we record people's religions, we record their ethnicities, we record their age, we record their income. You can provide quite powerful filtering on that using code-based software. So you could say, I only want to look at the people who are aged between 36 and 38, earn over £40,000 a year, and live in London. And you can code that in and you can run it and you can extract your sample that way in a really powerful way, rather than using something like Excel where the process of doing that filtering is much more manual. What it basically does is it gives you a much more sophisticated and comprehensive set of tools to analyze your data than the spreadsheet-based data analysis packages. So I'll
Thank you.
provide you an example of this is bad data practice. There's a concept in data science that we call tidy data, and it's this concept that good data management makes statistics easier. So if you cast our minds back a few minutes to when I was talking about our laboratory experiment that was comparing the growth rate of different microbes on a different food source, I might have collected my data in this way, where I've got a date column down the left-hand side, and then I've got different replicates of my two treatments across the top in ABC and ABC, and I'm recording numbers about how much they've grown from day to day. However, what you can see is that my date column is really inconsistent. One day I've written Monday, one day I've written the date with the day first, then the month, then the year. The next day I've written it with the month, and then the day, and then the year. Then I've written the date in a completely different way. And then I've got a date with year, month, and then day. That's really inconsistent and makes my analysis an absolute headache later on. And also, it would make it really difficult for me to join this data onto anything else that I was measuring on the same day. You can see I've also got some missing values in my data where I just haven't made a measurement on one of the days in day B and another day in replicate B, and it's just a little bit messy. The concept of tidy data is that you should have one row of your data for each way in which your measurement may vary. And I'll show you an example of that. This is what clean data would look like, where I've got a column for my date. I've got a column for the species that I'm monitoring. I've got a column for what replicate it is. And then I've finally got a column for the growth rate. And you can see that for each of these replicates, so A, B, and C, I've recorded the date an additional time, and I've recorded the species an additional time. And I would follow that all the way through my analysis. So the next rows in this, again, might be the 1st of January 2024. It might be a different species, but the replicate would be A, replicate would be B, then C, and the growth rate. And what this does is, although it makes for very what we call long data, so you might end up with many, many rows in your spreadsheet, which again makes it more akin to being analyzed by those code-based methods. It keeps your data tidy, and it would enable me to join on different data sets because everything's consistent and everything's clean. So this concept about taking data that's perhaps imperfect, maybe we don't control it, and we've taken it from a website or downloaded stock market data, for example, and the dates aren't quite right. The process of getting it to this state is called data cleaning, and you do that really using those code-based methods. And it's a very powerful way in which you can draw lots of data together and then use it in your statistical testing. So then let's look more now at analysis and testing hypothesis and visualizing the findings, which is the next step of our model here. And I want to talk about the cholera pandemic really quickly. So this was in the 1800s. Obviously, we didn't have very sophisticated ways of storing data. You know, the internet was a long way off. And doctors at the time didn't understand how cholera was being spread. They just thought cholera existed in the air around them. It was infecting people and people were dying. And it wasn't until Jon Snow, who is one of the founding fathers of epidemiology rather than the Game of Thrones character, decided that he was going to try and put this data onto a map, that the fight against cholera really began to gather momentum. So this is a really small area of London on this map, and each red dot represents a death from cholera. The bigger the dot, the more deaths there are. And by plotting it on this map, you realize that where there is a big cluster of a large number of deaths, it's around the water pump. And that's what led the epidemiologists to understand that cholera was in fact not in the air all around us. It was a waterborne disease, and it led to massive investment in terms of cleaning up the water system and providing better sanitation and a more developed system before cholera was able to be, thankfully now, a thing of the past. And I want to draw your attention to this quote by David McCandless, who is the founder of a website called Information is Beautiful. And he says, by visualizing information, we turn it into a landscape that you can explore with your eyes, a sort of information map. And when you're lost in information, an information map is kind of useful. And that's exactly what this is. We've taken the information, so geospatial data, like I mentioned in the beginning, we've plotted it onto a map, which is a data visualization in itself. And it's enabled us to gain insight from the numbers of deaths that we perhaps would have missed if they were just in a table. And it's enabled us to drive action by understanding what the data was trying to tell us. So a couple of points on data visualization. The best thing that you can do is condense it down to their simplest form. So this is for a study that I did on analyzing the sentiment of the US political parties towards China. And I've done it so I can explore the data this way. I can see the spread of my data, so how different they are in terms of the points at the bottom towards the points at the top. I've got some descriptive statistics, which we'll talk about in another session, that describe the average of my data and how spread out it is. And then the last thing on the right is it shows the distribution of my data. So it's looking at, well, where there are more points, the violin plot gets wider, the thing that looks like a wave. And it's showing me that I've got a lot of data clustered at different points, but there's a lot of overlap between the two parties in terms of how much they're talking about China from year to year. This is a really useful data visualization for me to explore my data, but it's not a very good data visualization for me to try and communicate what the data is trying to say. So we need to condense that message down into a simpler form. And in this case, a simpler form is a line chart. And if we plot that data over time, what we can actually see is that Republicans are speaking much more on the subject of China than Democrats are. And they're speaking more about it over time. As we can see that the lowest point is in 1968, at the bottom left-hand corner of the graph, and the highest point was in 2020. So we can deduce these trends from the data by visualizing it this way. We can see that China is becoming a more pressing issue in the United States than perhaps it was historically. And I've got one more quote for you from Mark Twain. He says, "I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I'm writing you a long one." And by that, I mean, it's very, very easy to put all of the data that you have on a single graph. It's quick, it's easy, you can see it, but it's not very meaningful. So when you condense it down, when you shorten the letter that the data is trying to communicate, that's when you really get to good quality analysis and good quality statistics. The last step of our model is a conclusion. This is where we interpret our data is where we tell people what we've found. But also, you'll notice that this model has the endless cycle written in the beginning. And that's because at the conclusion, this is where we form new ideas. Data tells us very specific things, and it often causes us to have more questions that we then want to go back to the problem stage at and think, how do we answer that question? Follow that back through to the plan of how do we measure that? How do we collect the data? What study design do we need? How do we manage that data? How do we clean it? And then how do we analyze the new data and draw new conclusions? So this is the cycle of my life, really. It's what I do from day to day. I take data, I analyze it, I manage it, I visualize it, I draw conclusions. In my case, give that conclusions to officials to make decisions or enact new policy. And then I'm just figure out, what's the next question? What's the next problem that we need to answer? How do we solve these things going forwards? That brings me to the end of what I planned to say. I've highlighted some useful resources here that I think are worth taking a look at if you enjoyed the content of this class today, or if you wanted to learn any more. The Art of Statistics by David Spiegelhalter. He's a professor at the University of Cambridge, and is a really good book aimed at people with no statistical background and how they can help understand the numbers that are in the world around us today. We've also got StatQuest, which is a YouTube channel about how it very simply explains different statistical tests. More or Less, which is a British podcast about statistics, and also just highlighting The Economist magazine as a really good source of taking data from understanding problems and communicating it really effectively in a very condensed way. I think that's the end of my slide. I can see there's about 20 things in the chat. So if anyone has a question, then do shout out now.
Yeah, just a quick question from Promise. Wanted you to say a little bit more about the spreadsheet based and the code based, and how can we access it properly?
Sure. So spreadsheet based tools should come built into whichever computer system you're using. I'll show you an example of something here. Let me see if I can find it. So let's have a look at this stock data compiled file. Give me a second if I open it in the right software. So I'm just going to open this with numbers, which is just a spreadsheet-based tool. See, it'll take a while to think about it, and you can see that it's got my data in here. It's very long. It's there's no way that I'm ever going to scroll through this and try and read everything. However, if I loaded that into a code-based environment, which would be this window here, which I'll try and do for you live, but usually is a little bit time consuming. You'll hold on just a sec. You see that I can read in my data using code. This is completely free software that you can just download from our studio, the company. So bear with me 1 second. I'll just do this. Sorry, I've not loaded the packages in correctly. So it's more complicated to do it this way, but it does give you a lot more power in your analysis. So I'm going to load in this data object that I've called final, and I can view it like a spreadsheet. I can see all of the data in there, but let's say I only wanted to look at transactions that were by transactions. I could type in code to analyze this. So I want to take my final data and I want to filter it on a specific variable. Can't type under pressure, and I can run that. And now I have a new data set that only has stale transactions in it. So when you're collecting lots of big data, it can be a really powerful way to interact with your data quite quickly and filter it down to exactly what you want or exactly what you need to answer your question at hand. Does that answer your question? Did you want me to say anything more on that?
I think that'll do. Ismail has a question. Go ahead and unmute your microphone, Ismail.
Hello.
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 Hi.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Yeah. My question is this. Can statistics be applicable to application programming interface? Can I repeat?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Can statistics be applicable to application programming interface?
In which respect? In terms of like pulling data from an API?
In terms of communication and programming data too, and stuff, something like
Yeah, I think it's definitely applicable. I think if you ever want to communicate any data, statistics is really the vehicle in which you're going to do that. Without statistics, it's quite difficult to make conclusions on your data. You can't say what they enable you to do, and what I might cover in a future session if I come back to speak, is that they give you confidence in what you're saying. You know, they enable you to say, for example, if we flick back to this example of different laboratory experiments, they enable me to say species A grew better using this food source. Whereas without
Seth,
statistics, yeah,
if I could rephrase that question, you know how
yeah,
all algorithms are used to actually create what people should be seeing on the internet? What's the difference
yeah.
between algorithms and statistics?
The algorithms is trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Algorithms are part of machine learning, which is fundamentally built upon statistics. And there will have been statistics done in terms of testing that algorithm that it is returning, it's performing as it is expected to perform. So algorithms have a way of, so think of a social media algorithm as an example. The data that it measures, it's measuring whether you are stopping and looking at specific things. Statistics will be run in the background saying, okay, this person is stopping and looking at things like this more than other things. So we will give them more of what they want to look at. The algorithm handles the return of finding things that you'll be interested in and surfacing them on the screen. The statistics is understanding your preferences in terms of you're stopping more on this without the statistical component of knowing that you are in fact stopping on it more. The algorithm wouldn't be able to function because it wouldn't know what to return to you.
Okay. It's kind of a sophisticated concept to be talking about right now, I think,
Mm.
because you'd almost have to show
Yeah,
examples.
yeah. It's a few lectures ahead, that one, but a
Okay,
good question nonetheless.
Clinton has a question. Can the PPD model be used when collecting data for carbon footprint of a given sector?
Yeah, yeah. The PPDAC model can be used for any research question that you might have. It's the framework that I would encourage everyone to use when you're thinking about collecting data and analyzing it in answer to a question.
Samuel asks, is it only for health that you would use control treatments and experimental treatments?
No, I would use it in any situation where I'm comparing two different groups. I would use control and experimental treatments. So it doesn't have to be for health. It can be looking at, tree growth or looking at growth of financial growth. You'd want to have a control in which you compared against and an experimental treatment as well.
Okay, now here comes a big question. How
Okay.
sophisticated does the statistical analysis have to be published? Can it just be a simple linear regression and good to go? Or does it have to be more sophisticated?
No, I've published many linear regressions. I think a lot of the time people try and run statistics that are too sophisticated, and you don't. Part of being a statistician is understanding when to use the right test, and that's something that we could cover in future. But a linear regression is more than sophisticated enough to be published.
And then as far as writing up the results, does that have
Mm-hmm.
to be really complicated, or can it just how simplified can the results be?
The results, you want to write them as simply as possible. This isn't the most motivating thing I'll ever say, but you want your results section to be relatively boring, and that you write it in a way that's quite dry, so people just understand the results. You talk about how exciting they may or may not be in the discussion, but you do need to understand which statistics or which outputs from the tests that you've used you need to write in the text, and that's where results sections can get a bit complicated. And again, that's something that we could cover in a future session if there was interest.
There is definite interest because using statistics is so valuable and so powerful, especially in the future. Like that one quote you had, the data is oil.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is, yeah, we want you back over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Now, really,
Sure.
your presentation was so well organized, and that introduction to statistics is just so perfect on what you did. I really loved that one graph you did about precise and accurate and showing the different
Yeah.
variables.
Yeah, we can flip back to that one if you like.
Yeah. I think each way of, I think when you're looking at your data, you have to figure out where it is on there, right? Is that kind of one of the first things you want to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. You'd want to look at how accurate and how precise you've been. I get, ideally you'd be on the left-hand side of this graph, really accurate and precise. If you can avoid it, you definitely don't want to be on the right-hand side, because that's going to make your statistical life quite difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. So yeah, it's a good visualization to bear in mind when you're collecting your data. And if you start to see a lot of imprecision, then it's maybe something you want to catch early on, and try and compensate for that in your collection.
It's funny. I look at that one on the right, not accurate, not precise, and I might think, oh, that's going to reject the hypothesis, the null hypothesis, because thinking that the center of the circles is the null hypothesis. Well, how would you respond to that?
Well, a null hypothesis is always the inverse of your hypothesis, what you are trying to measure. So, for example, a hypothesis might be trees grow better during the day than they do at night, and you'd want to measure that you'd want to make sure that you're measuring that precisely, because if you got a lot of overlap, you wouldn't find a difference between your two treatment conditions, and that would lead to you accepting the whole null hypothesis, because you'd say there isn't a difference, but there in fact might be a difference, and it likely is a difference. The problem is that you've been so imprecise in your measurement that there's too much noise in your data for statistics to tell there's that difference between your groups. So the more precise you are, the easier you're making your statistical life, because your data is in good a shape as it can be. Whereas if you're collecting really poor data, there's a principle that I always bear in mind, particularly with machine learning, is that if you put garbage in, you're going to get garbage out, and that's something you should bear in mind with your experiments too.
So should we think about the center of this target as the alternative hypothesis or the null hypothesis? It sounds like you're saying the alternative hypothesis.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And so if you're not hitting your alternative hypothesis correctly, is it because your measurements aren't accurate and precise, or is it just because that's the true measurements?
Well, I guess if you can guarantee that you're being accurate and precise, it enables you to have trust in your statistical test. So it would enable you to correctly either accept your alternative hypothesis or accept your null hypothesis. What imprecision and inaccuracy do is they make that decision much harder, because you don't have the statistical power to tell the difference between the treatments that you're measuring.